literally that day, the imperial model had just crashed. It had gone from 500,000 suspected deaths in the UK down to 20,000. No one mentioned it. It wasn't mentioned in the fact or fiction story in the roundtable being done by CNN. We didn't see it in any of the news agencies we were looking at. All we saw was what took place during the podium speech, and Debra Burks had to cover it. This is what she had to say. And remember, did you see this in the news?
I'm sure many of you saw the recent report out of the UK about them adjusting completely their needs. This is really quite important. If you remember, that was the report that said there would be 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million deaths in the United States. They've adjusted that number in the UK to 20,000. So 500,000 to 20,000. We're looking into this in great detail to understand that adjustment. I'm going to say something that's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to do it in a way that we can all understand it together. In the model, either you have to have a large group of people who are asymptomatic, who've never presented for any test, in order to have the kind of numbers that were predicted. To get to 60 million people infected, or of 6 million people infected, you have to have a large group of asymptomatics, because in no country to date have we seen an attack rate over 1 in 1,000. So either we're only measuring the tip of the iceberg of the symptomatic cases, and underneath it are a large group of people. So we're working very hard to get that antibody test, because that's a good way to figure out who are all these people under here and do they exist. Or we have the transmission completely wrong. So these are the things we're looking at, because the predictions of the models don't match the reality on the ground in either China, South Korea, or Italy. We are about 5 times the size of Italy. So if we were Italy and you did all those divisions, Italy should have close to 400,000 deaths. They're not close to achieving that.
The predictions don't match the models, is what she said. Actually, if you'd watched the models we've been presenting for the last 3 or 4 weeks now on the subject, it really is matching our models. This is exactly what we've been reporting on the high wire when no one else was. And so after we got off the stage, we got to figure out what happened with Neil Ferguson. How did this happen? I mean, you can imagine more and more of you are watching our show. You were starting to question, does this model make any sense? We showed you 11 top scientists amongst dozens or maybe even more around the world that are stepping forward and saying, we do not trust this imperial model. And that's exactly what was going on. When we look back, there was a Twitter storm that had begun just earlier in the week, right around the 22nd. You see, Neil Ferguson, who had come up with the imperial model, was under attack by many different scientists and thought leaders in the world saying, where is your code? What's going on? We should now take that off for a second. Let me just talk to the people here for a second. I want to explain something, because I called a bunch of my friends around the world that deal in scientific modeling, and it really is a standard practice now that if you're going to do a model that affects global health in any way that affects other people, you're supposed to immediately present your code, meaning the background, all of the numbers that you came to your conclusion, helped you come to that conclusion, so that it could be peer-reviewed. This imperial model that obviously Debra Burks is talking about it because we followed it. It's really important to us. She didn't say it didn't matter because America never looked at that model anyway. She said this is a real concern. It's making us look at our numbers. We all have to rethink this, because Italy came nowhere near the death rate that model was predicting. And so scientists around the world were saying, Neil, you're supposed to give us your code, and we're really having a problem with it, especially when the death numbers all around the world are not making any sense. They're not coming anywhere close to your modeling. Why didn't you have it peer-reviewed? Why aren't you providing your code? This is one of the responses. This is sort of how he responded to it. He said this: I'm conscious that lots of people would like to see and run the pandemic simulation code we are using to model control measures against COVID-19. To explain the background, I wrote the code. Thousands of lines of undocumented code, 13 plus years ago to model flu pandemics. This was a 13-year-old model for flu he was using. Look at the statement right after it. 1 out of 19, it is disappointing that critical, this is one of the statements this person must have made. It is disappointing that critical decisions relating to the COVID-19 crisis in public health and the economy rely on scientific software containing thousands of lines of undocumented code, source code, which has never been publicly accessible. Where's the thread? Well, you know, let's get this out there. This person goes on to say, why haven't you just immediately released the code and allowed global community dissect it and work on it? Now is not the time to be embarrassed about some code. You're missing the power of open source to accomplish feats, especially when people are highly motivated. Everyone's demanding, show us the code. We've got great scientists around the world. How does he respond? He basically, in some British sort of way, says, piss off. This is what he ends up saying. I am happy to say that at Microsoft and at GitHub are working with at Imperial, JIDEA, and MRC Outbreak to document, refactor, and extend the code to allow others to use without the multiple days training it would currently require, and which we don't have time to give. Basically, I'm not going to give it to you now. I'm going to call you all a bunch of idiots because I would have to explain it, and somebody else is working on that. We've got Microsoft on it. Oh, really? So we've got Bill Gates, the guy that's telling everybody to lock down, the guy that has tons of money in pharmaceutical companies all around the world, is developing a vaccine as we speak. We're using him as the only person to look at this code? I mean, that really doesn't make sense. I think this last point in the tweets really hits it best. The probability, this is the bottom line, the probability that thousands of lines of C code, not peer-reviewed, non-documentation, no tests, is without errors is 0. The probability is 0 that there are not mistakes in that. Well, guess what happened? After all of this pressure, we ended up seeing the breaking news story. We didn't cover it here, at least I didn't see it. Maybe you did. We know Debra Burks talked about it, but did you see it on Fox? Did they really dig down into Neil Ferguson? This is the Washington Examiner. Imperial College scientist who predicted 500K coronavirus deaths in UK adjust figure to 20,000 or fewer. This is Daily Wire. Epidemiologist behind highly cited coronavirus model drastically downgrades projection. By the way, I want to point out that headline. Can we look at that headline really quick because this is important? We had a headline that was different than this when we broke the news story. The original headline had said that it was wrong and the code was wrong, and a lot of people accused us of over-sensationalizing, saying the Imperial Code was wrong. This headline was changed by Daily Wire after we had presented it. So let me be clear. The Daily Wire changed its headline. At one point it was saying that the code was wrong. Now they're just saying it drastically changed it, just to be clear. So let me clear that up. We're a weekly show. Let me clear up. If there's any misunderstanding, it wasn't wrong. It was just drastically changed. In fact, if you really look at the drop from 500,000 projected deaths in the UK down to 20,000 deaths, 20,000 to 500,000 means they missed it by approximately 2,000, 400%? Did we do the math? 2,400% is how far off this modeling was. And here from the Daily Mail, obviously irate is this article. There's powerful evidence this great panic is foolish, yet our freedom is still broken and our economy crippled. Professor Neil Ferguson was one of those largely responsible for the original panic, claiming 500,000 people could die. He or others from Imperial College have twice revised this terrifying prophecy, first to fewer than 20,000, and then on Friday to 5,700. You know, we told you to go ahead and watch this on CNN, as I said. We know what was taking place there, but no one decided to cover that. I think, to me personally, I mean, you can decide, and it's up to you to decide, do you think that was one of the biggest stories in the world when it comes to coronavirus? I do. I think it's really important that we have seen